Welcome to Tuesdays with Morrissey. I'm Adam Morrissey. Today I'm thrilled to be joined by Liz Wiseman. Liz is the CEO of Wiseman Group, a leadership R&D firm in Silicon Valley who served companies like Apple, Google, Microsoft, Nike, and Salesforce, as well as the author of best-selling books Multipliers, Rookie Smarts, and Impact Players. Liz, thanks for coming on the show today.
Well, it's my pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. Thank you. On a personal note, I must say how much I appreciate the way you write about seeing the potential of people, the power of asking the right questions, and also the counterintuitive value of not knowing. So to lay the conversation, lay the foundation for the conversation around your work as a leadership researcher, I'd be curious, what do you think the current status quo is of leadership in our organizations today?
Wow. Well, I could answer that, I suppose, two ways, which is one, how do I think leaders are doing, and look at it from a report card. And I suppose the short answer to that is I think leaders are still underutilizing talent. But I guess the other way to look at it is, what's it like to be a leader in an organization right now? And boy, I think it's a pretty tough job. I think if you are leading in any industry that is moving fast, which is most industries, you are leading in the dark, as we are trying to navigate uncertainty and ambiguity and lead our teams. We're not just leading our teams to kind of an unknown destination. We're leading people when it's unclear what's happening, and we can't quite see the destination, and we can't quite see what's going on in our peripheral vision. And it's a very different form of leadership when you're in the dark. And I think leaders are also in a job that a lot of them didn't ask to be put into. We often think of a job of a manager or a leader is to manage the performance of the team, but this job has evolved over the years to be, okay, you're not just in charge of the performance of the team, you're in charge of the well-being of people on your team, and you're responsible for their burnout and their mental health and their physical health, and you're responsible for social issues and inclusion and belonging, and you're a spokesperson for the organization. And it's a pretty broad job that I think some leaders are finding themselves ill-equipped. I don't know, maybe if you wanted to be a social worker, but you went into like business for the money, maybe this is a great job. But there's so many social issues, and I think a lot of leaders right now are trying to resuscitate their organizations coming out of the pandemic, and trying to kind of reinvigorate their teams as people have been experiencing so much disengagement and burnout. So I think it's a pretty hard job right now.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, at least in my own personal experience, as well as when you think about just the rapid acceleration of a lot of trends that are impacting industries across the board. In 2010, you released Multipliers, which is still an extremely relevant book in management and leadership today. I'd be curious, you had a long career at Oracle. What experiences and observations did you have that led you to see the concepts of multipliers and diminishers?
Well, in some ways, Multipliers was my post-Oracle therapy, trying to work out what I had experienced. And I think the short version of this is, I joined this organization that was full of brilliant people, just absolutely brilliant people, brilliant, driven. And I watched as those brilliant people got put into management roles, and I watched them struggle. And in many ways, what they were doing was struggling with their own intelligence, because they had been the problem solver, the person who had the answers, who got things done, and they're now in the leadership role, and their own capability is in many ways diminishing the capability of their team. And I think, when I left Oracle, I left with this observation of, man, why is it that a bunch of really smart people suck the intelligence and life out of their teams, whereas other really smart people, I don't know, they must use their intelligence in a different way, because people seem to be smart around them. Like, why do we shut down around some leaders and kind of become enlivened and at our best around others? And it was just my own observation, my own struggle to figure out how to be a good leader myself, that led me to really ask that question in a pretty precise way and try to research to understand the difference.
Why do you think it is so hard for somebody to go from a high performing team member to a quote unquote multiplier manager?
Ooh, well, I think for everyone, for those who struggle to make this transition, which is I think most of us, there are different drivers for this. For some, it's the addiction to being a superstar. Like it feels pretty good to be the one who solves the problem, has the answers, brings in the deal, says the smart thing in the meeting. Like you get juice from this and it feels good. And then suddenly you're a manager and you have to stop doing so many of the things that got you to that place. And you now have to figure out how to get your team to do it. And for some people, they struggle with that. They don't realize that their role is shifted. For others, they're kind of addicted to that. Oh, I don't know, the high of being a star. For other, it's breaking hard habits. And then I think for a lot of leaders, they say, "Man, I just feel so much pressure to know things and to have answers, and I'm in a meeting and I get called on a carpet and I need to know right away, or people line up outside of my office like, hey boss, what should we do about this?" And so it just feeds this need to not have good questions but to have ready answers. And I think for some there's probably also some insecurity going on, meaning, well, when I kind of the superstar of the team, like everyone knows my value, but now as a manager, like what is my value, and what if people on my team are amazing? Then do I look like I'm not needed or I'm not doing anything?
Yeah. And then on the flip side, how can you get comfortable with releasing some control and letting people learn their own lessons?
I had this funny experience at Oracle where I was a brand new manager and I must not have been doing a great job making this transition. My boss stopped into my office one day and he just said, Liz, as far as I'm concerned, you can read novels all day long as your team gets done what they need to. I was very young when I got thrown into management, and I thought he has lost his mind. Like, first of all, I don't really read novels, and I'm certainly not going to do that at work. I'm not going to kick back here and, I don't know, read War and Peace. And I just thought, like, what is he trying to say? And then I finally figured out what he was saying is, as a leader, your productivity is not what's important. Like, it doesn't matter how hard you're working. What matters is how much great work you can get from your team. And I think he was pointing me to the fact that sometimes to get more from your team, you have to do a little bit less yourself.
Yeah, it's a lot like that concept from Andy Grove's book High Output Management about leadership leverage. The managers measured by the output of their teams. You built on multipliers with two other books, Rookie Smarts and Impact Players. What did you see and learn over the last 10 or so years since multipliers that motivated you to build on that work?
Mm. Well, some of it is just like a need to chomp onto a new question. So some of it is like my own need to be in the mode of asking rather than answering. But, have spent the last decade and a half helping leaders, be better leaders and get the most out of their teams. And so I've been very focused on the mindsets and practices of the leaders. And then I started to get what I affectionately call warranty calls. And that's when kind of people, they find me, I don't know, they either email me or call me up or like pull me aside in a conference center and say, "Hey, I read your book," or "Hey, I heard you speak," or "Hey, I went to the multipliers workshop that my company runs and I did those things and it didn't work." And what they described was what they did as a leader, but they didn't get the response from their team that they were expecting. Now, this is not what most people's experiences, but there were enough people saying, like, my team didn't step up. So then I had to start to understand, like, well, wait a minute. The leader is one variable in this equation. And of course, the way we show up as leaders really matters, whether we get innovation in a high engagement environment, high contribution environment, but the way that the contributor shows up matters as well. And I think there was this moment where it was particularly pointed. I think it's Salesforce, and I was teaching a workshop on multipliers, and one of the managers, he raises his hand. He's like, yeah, okay, I get it. I want to be a multiplier. And as a leader, I have to show up with the right mindsets and practices, but like you can't multiply zero. And at first I thought he was saying he had a bunch of dummies on his team, but then he was saying, it's like, no, I have to show up right, but so do the people on my team. And so I started to look at, well, what are the responsibilities on the talent side? Like, what do we need to do if we want to do work that's really impactful? You know, I guess another way of looking at this is some people are easier to multiply than others. Yeah. And there's certain people that an ounce of good leadership just goes a long way. And then there are other people who come with sort of stuck mindsets, and it's a little harder to coax them into doing something kind of amazing. And it's not for lack of talent, and it doesn't tend to be for lack of hard work. It tends to be limiting mindsets.
Yeah, it's a really interesting concept. When I was reading your books, I was thinking about there's a lot of practices. You mentioned the multiplier workshops where people will learn a lot of practice. How much do you think effectiveness is driven by people's, I'm going to call it personalities, but it also captures mindset and presence versus the practices and processes that they run?
Well, I wish I had an evidence-backed, researched answer to that question. I think you have to talk to psychologists to figure out how much of that is extensible, how much of that is changeable. We've been doing some of our own study, not on all aspects of personality, but we have been looking at the characteristics that we find in impact players, people who are doing work of extraordinary value inside of organizations. And we find some of those are easier to learn than others. And I don't know if it's because it's part of their personality or part of their lived experience. And here are the ones that we find are hardest for people to change. And they happen to be at kind of like they form sort of the nucleus to what we see in impact players is a sense of agency. The psychologists would call it agency. This really strong internal locus of control that says, okay, I'm not the victim of what's happening around me. I'm like the boss of me. Like I can influence what happens to me. I can take charge of situations. That is harder for people to adjust later in life. I don't know if that's part of their personality or if that's part of early career experiences where they took charge of something and some short-sighted boss slapped their hands and said, no, like that's my responsibility. We learn helplessness. That's one that's hard to change. Strangely, someone's sense of informality can be hard to change. Informality meaning how much hierarchy do I see in the world and how much hierarchy do I subscribe to? Like some people grow up in cultures or homes or in organizations where it's like, no, this is the boss and these are the little people, and little people are to be seen and not heard. And, you don't argue with authority figures and on and on. And that's one that tends to be a little bit more hardwired into people by the time they get to the workplace. And there's a couple others.
Yeah, no, it's definitely super interesting. I mean, it definitely seems bigger than work because some of the lived experiences we're bringing aren't just from early careers, but they could also be from our youth and things we learned. Why do you think the topics of creating multipliers and impact players are so important?
Mm. Well, all of my work, there's a theme that goes across my work. It took me several books to realize there was a theme going, and really that theme is how do we utilize all of the talent that's available to us on our team, in our organization, in our communities, and how do we not waste people's best intention on contributing. And I think one of the reasons why these ideas have resonated is that people come to work really, and here's the thing, Adam, here's what I have learned over the last decade and a half studying some of the best leaders, some of the worst leaders. I have learned that people all around the world, whether they work in corporations or they're entrepreneurs or they work in tech or hospitality, they come to work desperately wanting to contribute everything they've got. And when they can, when the leaders create that environment, when they kind of bring the right mindsets, like they would describe work and hard work as thrilling, exhilarating, like enabling, it's a build-up experience. But when they can't, they describe work as frustrating, exhausting, draining, demoralizing. You burn out. And what I've begun to see is that, people don't tend to burn out because they're working too hard, which is how we tend to see it. Like, oh no, like I got so much on my plate. Like I'm so tired. I'm burnt out. People tend to burn out for lack of impact. Working hard on something, but not making a difference, not seeing the fruits of your labors. And, I think this is one of the reasons why these ideas have really resonated is because people want to contribute fully. And managers are now dealing with a situation where they typically have more demands than they have the resources to do that. And so the idea of being able to get access to all of the intelligence on the team, like that's compelling. And, people are working really, really hard. And the idea of working hard, going through the motions, but not having impact, I mean, honestly, it hurts. And so this idea that we can have more impact, and we can be an impact player on a team without working harder, without necessarily being smarter or more capable, but by orienting ourselves to where we can add the greatest value, it's kind of a ticket out of this world of exhaustion and burnout and overwhelm that we seem to be in right now.
Yeah, I was really struck reading the research about how the average managers only get 66% out of their people. It just seems like an awfully lot left on the table. You know, one concept I've heard you talk a little bit about is you did a speech for BYU, I believe it was, on the power of not knowing.
Mm.
Can you speak a little bit about that concept and what it means to you?
Well, well, let's start with kind of our common notion of knowledge is like knowledge is power. And we often hear that, and to know more is to have more power. But I've actually seen through several research projects that we tend to be at our best when we know the very least. As contributors, as artists and engineers and salespeople, when we're in our zone of expertise, we're very productive, but we have ready answers. We've got things at the ready, and we're quick to just say, oh yeah, I know what this issue is. We tend to be impervious to feedback in this space. We tend to rely on our own knowledge because it's vast, and it can be a productive way of working, but it's not usually an innovative way of working, or it's a very self-oriented, and we often miss what's happening around us. However, when we're new to something, when we're in a place of not knowing, well, we tend to ask questions. We are desperate for feedback, and we actually pull in more expertise than we would if we were a lone expert, because we go out and say, I don't know how to do this. Do you know how to do this? Hey, and so we're gathering in all this expertise. We have no points on our scoreboard, so we're looking to put some points on there. So we tend to actually move fast, and we actually don't make big, bold moves when we're new to something. We tend to take baby steps. And so we iterate and pivot. It tends to produce this state that so many entrepreneurs and organizations are trying to operate in, which is this like curious, open, lean MVP kind of way of working. And so it helps us as performers. But then when managers can get out of this place of knowing and dispensing answers, and they can instead ask questions and rely on the expertise of the team, well, they tend to be at their best and they enable other people to be at their best. So, so many times I've seen that it's not the knowledge we bring that's so valuable. It's really our ability to learn fast. And maybe today the most important skill is really not what we know, it's how fast we can learn.
Yeah. And that those circumstances put you in a place of asking questions and curiosity. A lot of the practices that are come inherently, the multiplier practices come more inherently in those situations of kind of being at the edge. Are there organizations or leaders that you think people should be looking to as a model for multiplier leadership and impact players?
Well, there's a number of organizations who I think are doing some amazing things. There's actually an industry that I'm really interested in is what's going on in healthcare right now. We're seeing healthcare move from being a little bit of a sleepy industry on how they develop leaders and talent to, they're now 20% of the GDP in the United States is the healthcare industry. The demands are skyrocketing. The resources are shrinking, actually, as there's shortages of healthcare professionals. It's becoming a really critical industry. And I think that industry is really primed for figuring out entirely new models of leadership and contribution. And there's a number of healthcare organizations that we work with, whether they're insurance companies, hospital systems, provider systems, the pharmaceutical industry. There's a lot of reinvention going on there.
Awesome. I know you've been in Silicon Valley in the leadership kind of circles for a long time. So I'm curious, did you ever have a chance, and you mentioned him a couple times in your book, did you ever have a chance to meet the coach, Bill Campbell?
Yes, I did. And okay, so Adam, you might make me tear up.
Oh no.
Um, yeah, I did. And I interviewed him for the book, and I went to Bill Campbell's office. So this is Bill Campbell, who was a head coach of Columbia, football team, and then went into tech and worked at Apple, and then was the CEO of Go and Claris, and then Intuit, and then in his later years of life became the coach to a bunch of titans here in the valley. I met him through the Kleiner Perkins folks who said, oh, these multiplier leaders, you should talk to Bill Campbell because he's such a multiplier, and he's the one we bring in when we need to help a founder kind of really scale up their leadership. We kind of sick Bill on them. And, he was quite famously Steve Jobs' personal coach, and he worked with Larry and Sergey and Jeff Bezos and all those. So I went to meet Bill to, in my mind, do a multipliers interview. And he said, oh, yeah, I totally understand this concept of multipliers. It's what I'm doing. I'm helping these leaders, these titans, become these multiplier leaders. And he said, but man, I began my career as one of the great diminishers of all time. He goes, oh, I was absolutely a know-it-all. I told everyone what to do. I made all the decisions. I called the shots. I kind of showed off. And he described really quite a pattern of diminishing. And it wasn't until later in his career, I think it was when he was a CEO of Claris, that, and he's got Randy Komisar on his team. He's got Donna Dubinsky of Palm, the CEO of Palm. She's working for him. And finally, the team sends Donna as this emissary into Bill's office. And she's like, hey, Bill, you know what? We came to work with you because we really wanted to build something great, but we can't do this because you're kind of back to your old ways. You're making all the decisions. You're telling us what to do. Like, hey, newsflash, we are smart, capable people. And if you don't let us do our jobs, we're not going to work here. And Bill's like, what? Whoa. And he really took it in. And he described for me this process of very much changing and becoming a very different kind of leader. He then went on to be the CEO of Intuit. And, you know, I remember him saying, like the engineers are smart and you never give the engineer a solution like, hey, go build this for me. He said, you always define a problem for them and let them figure it out. And so I interviewed Bill. It was this great experience. And I'll never forget what he said to me as we were wrapping up the interview. He said, hey, Liz, this is a really important idea, this concept of multipliers. It's a really good idea. And then he said in full Bill Campbell fashion, he's like, don't F it up, okay? With maybe a little bit more color to that. And it was so strangely motivating and empowering. And that was the beginning of kind of this mentoring relationship where I went and interviewed Bill numerous times and filmed him. And I got to get coaching from one of the great coaches of the world. And every year I go back to Stanford to do participate in this summit that honors him and his legacy. And, he passed a few years ago from cancer.
Yeah,
You
yeah, yeah. I've read a lot of like the $1 trillion coach, and basically anything I can get my hands on in the kind of the Bill Campbell coaching tree. What's one piece of advice you'd give to listeners, whether leading themselves or leading others?
It's tempting to want to be the genius on your team, but your most valuable role as a leader, and maybe really what sits at the top of the intelligence hierarchy, is not the genius. It's the genius maker. And it's a transition that a lot of us have to go through as leaders, but that is really where your value comes from as a leader. I think when I look at what the best leaders do, when I look at the most impactful contributors do, all of them orient outward. They don't spend their days thinking about themselves. They are looking out to the people they lead. Like, what do those people need from me? And they look out at their stakeholders and their customers, and they're really thinking about what the world looks like through their eyes. And I think when we look, instead of like see everything through our eyes, when we can get inside other people's heads and see what their world looks like, that's when we really can create incredible value. And that's where we have our biggest impact. It's not
That's
pushing a
beautiful.
vision as much as seeing what things look like through other people's vision.
Yeah, when you were sharing that, I was thinking I recently heard a story. I guess Abraham Maslow was friends with Viktor Frankl later in their lives, and in late in Abraham Maslow's life, he never thought the hierarchy of needs was perfect. That self realization just didn't seem right. So towards the end of his life, he realized that self actualization isn't actually the top of the triangle; it's self transcendence. How can you start to transition to live for other people's, and in your words, see the world through their eyes?
Yeah, and when we do that, we don't entirely lose ourselves. It's not like, oh gee, my needs go unmet. That's where we can actually kind of self-actualize. It's like that's where we do our most valuable work. That's where we make our biggest contribution. And I think, most entrepreneurs figure out that having just a vision might get you started, but if you don't develop like market empathy, like what are people actually doing with this? What's valuable from their point of view? That's what allows the pivoting that happens for companies that really kind of hit it big as they figured out like how to really solve someone's problem.
Yeah, it almost sounds like you're describing like almost like a Joseph Campbell's hero's journey with two mountains. In your coaching career, have you seen, um, I imagine you've seen pretty incredible transitions from diminishers to multipliers. Is there one that stands out to you?
Oh, well, of course, I love the Bill Campbell transition.
It's a great story.
One of my favorites, and I have seen so many, hundreds, and that's what really inspires me and keeps me going. There's my own constant struggle, where it's to like slip back into the accidental diminisher and to try to keep my head above water that way. But the one that I think really always has struck me is it was days after the Multipliers book came out. And I had, I think, been on NPR Morning Edition. And someone had heard me speak for like 4 minutes about this idea, and it was a founder of a company, a global organization, and he's like, wow, I think I'm one of these diminishers that Liz is talking about. And so he sends a message into the website, like an inquiry, and it just said accidental diminisher seeking reform and recovery. And that was it. And I'm like, I have to talk to him. And he tells me, like, all of my early role models in the business world and at home were all diminishers. Like, it's the only thing I've ever known. And I'm actually deeply imprinted with that. And he said, I'm very much a diminisher, but I want to, and he was in his mid 50s. He says, I've got about 12 years left in my career, and I really want to go out as a multiplier. And I really want to help build other multipliers in this process. And he's like, can you help me? And it was such a thrilling experience to see him overcome some pretty deep programming that said, no, your job is to tell people what to do and to have answers, and you're the boss. And to see him kind of go through this zigzag path to figure that out. And, it's his, I think, is an interesting cautionary tale because he made tremendous changes. But his biggest struggle wasn't making the changes, it was other people's willingness to see him differently tended to lag that. And I think what I learned from this is when we are setting about to make significant changes in how we lead, how we interact, how we are in a relationship, that making the change is only half of the work. We also have to market those changes. We have to help other people see us in new ways. Like if you're trying to go from maybe a little bit of a self-orientation to a little bit more self-transcendent, like people have you in in their mind is like, okay, that's like a, take care of himself kind of person. And how do you help people? And you have to put on a little bit of marketing uh, logic and help people see you in new ways.
What would be an example of that marketing logic? Like, what was one of the things this individual did?
Well, the way I like to think of it is, well, he struggled, and I'm not sure he ever really was able to do that. But here's how I like to think of it. I like to think of it like opening a folder. So, when you start a new project, you tend to open a folder, so it's maybe going to be like client X or project Y. And so every time you read an interesting article or you encounter something or you do a file, you put it in that folder. But until you have a folder for it, you don't know where to put that stuff. And I like to think of it as opening a folder in other people's mind about what the new you looks like. And so you would tell someone, you know what, I want to be a better listener. You're going to notice, like, I'm going to try to speak less in meetings so that other people can speak more. And so you tell someone that that's what you're up to. So they open this up like, okay, you know what? Adam is going to be like, he's trying to be a better listener. And then when you do that, most of those behaviors go unnoticed by people. But they're like, oh, I noticed that Adam was asking a really good question and then listening for people's responses. And then they take that behavior and they drop that in the folder. And then they see it again. And again, if there's no folder, people tend to ignore it. People are consumed with their own kind of thoughts. And so they just start to collect evidence of that behavior. And then when you talk about like, here's what I've done, they're like, oh, of course, I've seen this, and that all support that conclusion. And I find that just this idea of creating folders counters a lot of these problems.
No, that makes total sense. Thinking about almost that accountability partner. You're getting somebody to sit at the same side of the table to support and recognize your change.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Liz, you've been very generous with your time. Before I let you go, what's the best way for listeners to keep up on the work you're doing at Wiseman Group?
Oh, okay. There's the wisemangroup.com. And there's, if anyone has read the books and want some additional resources, we've tried to pack the website with a lot of resources for teams and individual learners. So the wisemangroup.com. Let me see, on LinkedIn, I'm at Liz Wiseman. On Twitter X, Twitter now
Yeah.
X, at Liz Wiseman. I'm pretty easy to find.
Awesome. Well, we'll make sure to have links to all those references in the show notes. But thanks again for everything you've done to allow people to move around the world with more agency and freedom and see the potential of people. And thanks for coming on the show.
Oh, well, thank you.